Parts 1 and 2 of this series presented the logical structure on which all of modern science is built, and a series of common logical fallacies which, if present, result in bad science. Therefore, bad science may be defined as any scientific endeavor which fails to adhere to the fundamental, logical structure of science, or which bases its conclusions on logical fallacies. The first example of present-day modern science that we will analyze is the theory that carbon dioxide is a primary or significant driver of global warming. Perhaps the most common argument associated with this theory is the assertion that evidence of warming is evidence that warming is driven by CO2. However, this line of reasoning is a converse error, which we discussed in video 2. To see why it is a converse, consider the logical statement: if warming is driven by CO2, then evidence of warming will be present. The converse of that statement is, if evidence of warming is present, then warming is driven by CO2. But we know that the converse is invalid and therefore cannot conclude that evidence of warming is evidence that it was caused by CO2. To make this clearer, let's use the same logic on the statement: if aliens are projecting an energy beam towards Earth, then evidence of warming will be present. The converse says, evidence of warming is present, therefore aliens are projecting an energy beam towards Earth. The point is, evidence of warming is as much evidence of aliens as it is of CO2, because both are invalid results of the converse error. Evidence of warming is not evidence of its cause. Additionally, we often hear that there is a consensus among scientists that CO2 is the cause of global warming. But that statement is an appeal to authority and is an invalid logical fallacy. Popularity or proclamations are never a valid basis for scientific conclusions. Meanwhile, the theory that global warming is driven by CO2 emissions is strongly dependent on computer modeling and computer simulations. However, computer models only do what we program them to do, and we can only program them to do what we already understand. Furthermore, it is standard procedure when developing a model to make sure that the model does what we expect it to do, and then adjust it until it does just that. In this way, a model is the product of confirmation bias and circular logic. This is why it is important to realize that computer models are not reality. To treat them as reliable representations of reality is a strawman fallacy and should never be done. Compounding this issue is the fact that, in nonlinear systems like the climate, small changes in parameters often result in large changes in the result. For climate modeling in particular, there is great uncertainty for the values of a great many parameters. To deal with these uncertainties, modelers adjust their unknowns until they achieve results they expect. However, this is a form of pseudoscience because it promotes results we expect and rejects those we don't. Despite these issues, models still serve many useful purposes. However, predictions in the real world are not one of them, because all models are based on fictional worlds and their predictions only apply to those fictions. Meanwhile, we often see examples of collapsing ice shelves or receding glaciers presented as evidence that glaciers are melting everywhere. But that is the fallacy of improper induction, and it ignores the hundreds, if not thousands of glaciers around the world that are expanding. A general conclusion, based on limited examples, is a fallacy. As a side note, imagine if those ice shelves never fell. They would continue to expand until the entire Earth was covered in ice. That's why they fall. Let's turn our attention now to some fallacies that are procedural. There are several examples of confirmation bias associated with global warming theory. For example, a group at the Climate Research Unit in East Anglia loaded historical temperature data into a program which processed the data by subtracting temperature degrees from early data and then adding more degrees to later temperature data. This has the effect of forcing the data to show a temperature increase where none existed. It is deliberate alteration of data. Another research group plotted temperature data which was extracted from tree rings. The data showed that temperatures were decreasing after the year 1960. But the researchers wanted the data to show an increase. So they discarded the data after 1960 and replaced it with some higher temperature data they found from a different source. Then they joined the two different and incompatible data sets and presented them as one. They deliberately altered their data in order to manufacture a predetermined result. In yet another example of data manipulation and bias, an audit of the temperature data from U.S. weather stations showed that many stations were highly unreliable. This was because of urbanization, which causes urban temperatures to read artificially higher than rural temperatures. Stations that were once rural were now on black-topped parking lots or below air conditioner exhaust vents, and some were even exposed to jet exhausts at airports. To solve the inconsistency, the reliable rural stations were recalibrated to agree with the unreliable urban stations. This deliberate alteration produced an artificial warming trend in the data. While most scientists find the alteration of data to be reprehensible, it is actually a matter of official policy for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Their policy guide states that the summary for policymakers should be written first, and reports and data should be edited to conform to the summary. Altering data is a matter of official policy. Meanwhile, intimidation and censorship are often difficult to identify because they result in silencing the opposition. Therefore, you may never even hear or be aware of the opposing view to know that it has been suppressed. For example, during the Obama administration, universities received letters from Congress threatening their funding for having climate deniers on their staff. Meanwhile, Obama's Attorney General Loretta Lynch asked the Justice Department to look into putting climate deniers in jail. Also around this time, editors of two scientific journals, Climate Research and Geophysical Research Letters, were forced to resign because they each allowed articles to be published which were critical of global warming theory. Although shocking at the time, such firings have become commonplace today. Instead of healthy debate, the opposition is simply silenced. Up to this point, we've seen many examples of logical and procedural fallacies associated with global warming theory. However, that doesn't prove that the theory is wrong. You may recall, way back in our first video, that there is only one way to evaluate a scientific theory. That one way is to test it. Fortunately, the theory that global warming is driven by carbon dioxide is a scientifically valid theory. What makes it valid is that it is testable. So let's look at a couple of the theory's predictions and test them against real-life observations. One of the predictions made by all of the models is that the temperature trend in the tropical troposphere should increase at a rate about 2 times faster than the surface rate. This prediction makes sense and is necessary because, if CO2 in the atmosphere is causing the warming, then the atmosphere should be warming ahead of the surface. It turns out that we have about 40 years of temperature data from both weather balloons and satellites, and that data shows that the temperature trend in the tropical troposphere is about half the trend at the surface. This is exactly the opposite of what the theory predicts, so based on the most fundamental principle of science, we must conclude that the theory is incorrect. In another test, global warming theory predicts that the rate at which heat is radiated into space will decrease as the ocean temperatures increase. These figures show the predictions from 11 different computer models, and all of them show a decrease in radiation as the ocean temperatures rise. This makes sense because warmer oceans will release more water vapor into the atmosphere. Since water vapor is a more effective greenhouse gas than CO2, the water vapor is expected to prevent more heat energy from radiating into space. Meanwhile, we have several decades of satellite data that measures this radiation. It shows that the rate increases about 3 times what greenhouse gas theory predicts it should decrease. So again, observations are the opposite of the predictions, and we must again conclude that the theory is incorrect. At best, we can say that the theory works for the fictional world of the model. But we do not live in that fictional world. Even if one argues, it is our best theory, so we must accept it. That is an appeal to ignorance, and best theory or not, we still know for certain that the theory is wrong. All of the climate disasters that are predicted from increasing carbon dioxide are based on models that are demonstrably false and predict the very opposite of what we observe in the real world. Meanwhile, it should be understood that CO2 is the primary food source on the planet. It is also a byproduct of nearly every animal activity, many geological processes, and most energy sources. Regulating CO2 means regulating how you heat and cool your home, how you cook your food, what you can eat, where you can go, and how you will get there. It means to regulate nearly every aspect of your life, and it is all based on an idea which has no scientifically valid justification. It is just bad science.